So welcome to our panel discussion on social media and democracy. Where do we go from here? This is the first of several fall events that MIT's Anthropology, History, and Science, Technology, and Society program are jointly presenting around the theme of democracy, citizenship, and technology. It is also, as you see on the visual behind me, the first in a new computational cultures initiative that has been organized by MIT's School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Now, outsiders, of course, are sometimes surprised to discover that MIT even has fields like anthropology and history, but the Institute has long recognized that top-notch programs in the humanities and social sciences are vital conversation partners in discussions about the past, present, and future of science and technology. The two event series I've just mentioned are intended to bring the kinds of conversations that we're having in our classrooms to broader audiences and to find new ways to engage our colleagues across the Institute and beyond. Now, I'm not going to regale you with a list of all the other events in the series, but simply mention on November 1st is going to be our next event on technology and elections. I invite you to have a look at the Computational Cultures Initiative website up there, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to be informed of future events, contact the STS program at that address. So tonight we're going to be picking up on issues related to technology and politics that have been in the news in the US and around the world. We're excited to have 4 speakers from very different backgrounds to help us better understand what's been going on and what we might do about it. So here is the format for this evening. Momentarily, I'll introduce all of our speakers, and then we'll hear each speak for about 10 minutes. We'll then follow up with some discussion and debate amongst the panelists, and then we'll open the floor to questions, comments, and so forth. Finally, I'll invite closing remarks from our panelists and send you all off for pizza and more conversation outside the room. Finally, let me mention that if there are any grad students in the group, grad students from any program, you're welcome to join the speakers for further in-depth discussion in room 4153 at 7 o'clock. Okay, so now let me introduce our panelists. First in the lineup is Dr. Siva Vaidhyanathan, who's the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia, where he produces a TV show, a radio program, several podcasts, and the Virginia Quarterly Review magazine. After 5 years as a professional journalist, he earned a PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas, Austin, and has subsequently held a number of academic positions across North America. Most recently, Siva authored the book Anti-Social Media: How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, and he'll be talking about that this evening. He is also the author of The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. Just a side note, you can see his suitcase right here. At around 6 o'clock, he will be racing out to Logan Airport to beat the hurricane. So it's not a statement on our company, but he will be departing. Okay. Next, we have Professor Daniel Weitzner, who's the founding director of the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative and principal research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. He teaches Internet public policy in the MIT Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department, and from 2011 to 2012 was the US Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Internet Policy in the Obama administration, where there he led initiatives on online privacy, cybersecurity, internet copyright, and trade policies to promote the free flow of information. Our third speaker, David Edelman, is director of the Project on Technology, the Economy, and National Security, which is part of the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative. He has joint appointments at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab and the Center for International Studies here at MIT. Until January 2017, David served at the White House as Special Assistant to the President for Economic and Technology Policy at the National Economic Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that role, he led the White House team focusing on the digital economy, broadband telecommunications, spectrum and technology trade, as well as consumer cybersecurity, domestic and international data privacy, high-tech patent and copyright issues, and antitrust. Our fourth speaker will be Joan Donovan. Following her PhD in sociology and science studies at UC San Diego, Joan worked as a postdoc at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics, researching white supremacists' use of DNA ancestry tests, social movements, and technology. She's now at the Data and Society Research Institute, based in New York City, where she is the project lead for the Media Manipulation Project. Did I get that title right? You got it. Awesome. Okay, for several years, Joan has conducted action research with different networked social movements in order to map and improve the communication infrastructures that protesters build. In her role as a participant, she identifies information bottlenecks, decodes algorithmic behavior, and connects organizations with other like-minded networks. Again, we are really pleased to have this diversity of expertise sitting before you. Let me now turn the floor over to Siva.
Thank you, Jennifer. For a democratic republic to be healthy, it needs many things, but two of the most important things include the ability to motivate and the ability to deliberate. You can motivate people toward a goal, you can fire them up, you can tell them to show up in a square, you can tell them to show up at the polls, but if a democratic republic doesn't have the norms, platforms, and structures and habits that facilitate deliberation, there's no way for a democratic republic to face the truth, face the challenges, and map a path forward, right? There's no way to solve problems. Right now, here in the United States and through much of the world, we're really good at motivation, and we're just awful at deliberation. Now, Facebook did not cause this problem, but Facebook is not helping. I would say Facebook is hurting. Facebook is central in our lives. Facebook is even more central in the lives of people where democracy has shorter roots, where democracy is flimsier, where they don't take democracy for granted like we do, and yet democracy is certainly in more danger. Places like the Philippines, places like Thailand, places like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Kenya, Mexico, Brazil. How does Facebook make a difference in this formula? Well, let me describe three aspects of Facebook. These are the three things that make Facebook Facebook. Number one is its scale. 2.2 billion people use Facebook regularly. They're monthly active users, 2.2 billion. That's actually probably a slightly conservative number. That was as of February 2018. By now it might be 2.25, might be even close to 2.3. Facebook is growing at a steady pace, although not in North America. In North America, it's pretty much flatlined. But we're pretty saturated. But think about that, 2.2 billion people. There are not a lot of things that touch 2.2 billion people. There's oxygen, there's rain, and there's Facebook, right? So that is pretty astounding to even contemplate. The BBC would love to reach 2.2 billion people. 2.2 billion people in more than 100 languages. So think about all those challenges that Facebook faces: content management, content filtering, cleaning up its service so it's a better experience for users, getting rid of posts and items and pages and profiles that call for violence, call for genocide, stir up hatred, right? All the things that Facebook would like to manage better, but as we all know, it's having a real tough time doing it in English. Imagine trying to hire thousands of people who can speak and read Burmese, who can do this same job in Myanmar in opposition to the military government. That's a pretty unsolvable problem, Again, a function of its scale. That's just to pick one country and one language. Imagine trying to hire enough people to help manage content in India. Maybe 12 languages, maybe 15 languages, maybe 18 languages you need to manage. You have to hire enough people, they have to be well-trained, they have to understand the culture and politics in which they're operating, and they have to contribute ultimately to a machine learning system that might or might not actually deliver what was promised. 2.2 billion people. The second aspect of Facebook that makes Facebook Facebook, algorithmic amplification. Right? Facebook chooses what flies on Facebook through its algorithms. Facebook chooses what you see in your news feeds. Facebook chooses which of your posts rocket around and which fall quietly to the ground. What matters? Well, roughly, we don't know the secret formula, and the secret formula changes all the time, but roughly, we know that Facebook favors engagement or the potential for engagement, right? So it's guessing constantly. You post something, Facebook's looking for signals, how much this post resembles other posts, and how much engagement those posts generated. What is engagement? Clicks, shares, likes, comments. As of December, Facebook weighs comments much more heavily than all other forms of engagement. This was a turn that Mark Zuckerberg called a turn toward meaningful engagement, although he did not define meaningful and thus left it meaningless. But it basically means a lot of comments, right? So algorithmic amplification. What that means is, of course, that if I get on Facebook tonight and I put some wacky thing up there, denying the moon landing or saying that vaccines cause autism, I'm going to get a lot of response, most of it negative. A lot of my friends are going to tell me I'm out of line. They're going to post links to the Centers for Disease Control. They are going to post links to NASA, depending on which of these crazy things I posted. And every single time that they argue with me, they are helping me push that material out farther. It will rocket around because it's generating engagement, it's generating emotions. It'll generate more emotions than a cute picture of my golden retriever, which is usually how I get engagement. She's really cute, right? But it would rocket around. This is why you can't argue with the crazy on Facebook. The crazy always wins, right? The third thing about Facebook that we have to understand, and the thing that makes Facebook Facebook, is its advertising system. An advertising system that depends on massive and deep surveillance of not only every Facebook user, but people who are not on Facebook. Facebook manages to create dossiers on people who no longer have Facebook accounts or never will have Facebook accounts. It's a complicated process, but Facebook is profiling and creating predictive algorithms for all sorts of things so that it can target advertising effectively. Its advertising market is what makes Facebook so wealthy, but it also is one of the things that makes it so toxic. Because its ability to find an audience, to find just the right small group of people who might be moved to buy a product, to subscribe to a service, to vote for a candidate, or to join a movement is ultimately what makes Facebook so powerful. So combine those three things: the scale, the algorithmic amplification, and the most efficient, effective, inexpensive advertising system ever invented, with the possible exception of Google. Almost every problem you have heard about or read about from Facebook in the last 24 months is a function of at least one, but probably more than one of those three things. In addition, those are the things that make Facebook Facebook. So to fix Facebook, you have to undo Facebook. The problem with Facebook is Facebook. I'll leave it at that, and we'll get back to it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Siva. It's great to have you here, and congrats on the book. Good luck getting home. I want to try to talk with you about the question of whether we should fear big platforms. We have big platforms. In many ways, since the internet was first created, we've set as a technical design goal the idea that we ought to get good at building big global scale platforms of all sorts. There's economic imperatives that push us in that direction, and we've built a whole lot of social, business, technical infrastructure around the idea of bigness. And now we have people like Siva come along and saying, well, really, that may not be a great idea. And there are a lot of other people who actually say it in even more pointed ways. So I want to talk about this idea of big platforms. I was really pleased, Jennifer, that you encouraged all of us to come with some empirical examples, so I'm going to try to come with some of those. I will say that I'm kind of empirical example number one, because, and I'll just offer myself for scrutiny by others, in that a lot of the work that I did in the 90s was about creating the legal and policy environment whose consequences we're now living with. So I take this all pretty personally, maybe even guiltily. We're all good. But I want to start by talking just a little bit about what was the environment that produced an early optimism about building platforms in the way that we've actually now succeeded in building them. Why did we do that? I want to look at some of the disruptive power of these platforms, both in the direction that Siva and others point to, and also in directions that I think are positive, and then talk about some directions that we might take from there. So if you'll zoom back a little bit to the early 1990s, this was before there was really an internet as far as most people were concerned, but it was certainly a time when we were in full-on technical exceptionalism and optimism and actually considerable sort of deregulatory policy making in the United States, at least, and to some extent around much of the rest of the world. But in the early 1990s, those of you who know your Bruce Springsteen will remember that the boss sang about 57 channels and nothing on. And in fact, there were 500 channels and nothing on. So we had, in the US, invested huge amounts of money directly from consumers who paid their telephone bills and their cable television bills, and we got more and more advanced telephone networks that weren't very good at helping anyone to do anything other than make the same old telephone calls, and we got more and more cable channels that weren't very good at doing anything other than creating advertising revenue, much like Facebook and Google and the other platforms are good at creating advertising revenue, but they weren't very good for speech. And there was a real sense on both the right and the left that speech, political speech, cultural speech, artistic production was very much dominated by a small set of mainstream gatekeepers. So there was a real excitement when the idea of the internet came along that more people would be able to speak, that we would have an abundance of speaking opportunities in First Amendment terms, and that we would have fewer gatekeepers controlling this speech. Oddly enough, this brought together a kind of a funny right-left consensus. Everyone from Newt Gingrich, who was in the process of taking over the entire political system in the United States, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I worked in the early 90s, thought that this was going to be a great thing. And there were initially pretty happy results from this. When the U.S. Supreme Court had to first look at the internet environment and try to understand what sort of free speech protections ought to be available on the internet, the court said that the internet is a, quote, unique and wholly new medium of worldwide communication that may fairly be regarded as a never-ending worldwide conversation. So this was a big success from the traditional First Amendment policy perspectives. We got diversity, and we got fewer gatekeepers, and we got abundance of communication opportunities. What we also got, though, was a bit of a challenge about how to deal with abundance in sort of typical United States puritanical terms. One of the challenges we got was how to make sure that kids didn't have access to too much sexually explicit material through these now newly abundant and gatekeeper-free communications platforms. And so the U.S. Congress struck a very particular kind of a policy deal. It's a deal that goes by the number 230, that's Section 230 of the Article 47 of the U.S. Code. It was an amendment to the U.S. Communications Act that made a very particular kind of deal with these new platforms. The deal was that the platforms were going to be encouraged to help people avoid speech they didn't want to see and help people get to the speech they did want to see in exchange for limiting the liability of those platforms for the content of speech of others. Now, what does that really mean? What that means is that the New York Times can print whatever it chooses to print, but it's responsible for everything. We rely on the editorial judgment of the New York Times to make decisions that are appealing to us if we're a New York Times reader, and people who read other papers or watch other television channels rely on editorial judgment to create a different slice of speech, a different slice of reality, different slice of culture. But that comes with a cost. If that speech ends up being libelous or illegal in some other way, the platforms, those editors are responsible. So we said something different about the internet platforms. We said, you filter out the porn or the speech that your users don't want to see, and we won't hold you responsible for that speech. It was a deal that said, take responsibility to keep your platform tuned to the way your audience wants it, and we'll reward you by reducing your legal risk. And it is only because of the existence of this particular liability, limited liability deal that we have platforms like Facebook, like YouTube, like Twitter, because certainly at the time they were created, none of these platforms could possibly have filtered through all the content that was flowing through their platforms and made sure that none of it was illegal, none of it was copyright infringing, none of it defamed anyone, et cetera. So we made a particular deal, and I'm going to come back at the end to a question about whether that deal has actually been honored. I think there's some pretty important disruptive effects of this big platform environment that we created. And I want to talk really quickly about three of them. The first disruptive effect that I was kind of happy about was that in 2008, the relatively unknown Senator Barack Obama was able to win the Democratic primary against the extremely well-known and extremely well-funded competing candidate, Senator Clinton, Senator Hillary Clinton at the time. He wasn't supposed to be able to do that. She had all the money, she had all the name recognition, but he had this insurgent platform that he could, as we might say today, manipulate, that he could use, that the campaign could use to get attention outside of the boundaries of the traditional media. So this was an example of the disruptive effect of big platforms, the ability to change the rules of communicating, working in a way that I think was quite positive from a democratic perspective. Second disruptive example, just recently, the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2014, more or less, with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, was an example of a movement that took to one of these big platforms, mostly Twitter, but also others, and was able to shape a conversation, shape a view of what was going on in society, largely contrary to, or at least around the edges of, what much of the mainstream media wanted to be talking about. Black Lives Matter was able to create a conversation that didn't exist, a conversation for which there was a fair amount of resistance from a variety of directions because of the unusual nature of these platforms that we created. And there's actually right at this very moment, Kate Starbird, who's a wonderful computer scientist who works in the HCI field, is talking about some of her work looking at the dynamics of discussions on Twitter. And she found, by looking very carefully at these discussions, that even though they are certainly quite contentious and various people might point to manipulations that go on in the course of those discussions. Twitter in particular enabled an alternative set of gatekeepers who were not the mainstream gatekeepers to shape a discussion and actually to shape a quite contentious framing of a very difficult issue in a way that I think really wouldn't have happened with traditional media. I'm running out of time, so I'll just say very quickly that the obvious next disruption was the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And I think there's no question that some part of what happened when you look at the democratic discourse that happened in these platforms, in Facebook, in Twitter, and elsewhere, was a failure of these platforms to take care of themselves, a failure of the platforms to live up to what I would call the Section 230 deal. We gave these platforms the ability to grow very quickly and with minimum legal restrictions, and I think they didn't keep their part of the bargain, and they've more or less admitted it now. They didn't expend the effort that we have generally expected, for example, television stations expend when they decide who to sell ads to, or newspapers when they decide to what to print, what kind of stories to run, or what kind of political ads to run. They didn't keep their deal. I think it's clear that these platforms are subject to a whole variety of manipulation. I think what is a little bit less clear is whether, number one, shrinking them would actually have the effect that we want. A shrunken Twitter, if we had 17 Twitters instead of one Twitter, I'm not sure we would have had the Black Lives Matter discussion that we ended up having, because it would have actually cost more to be in all those different platforms. So we do gain something from bigness. I think that what we lose, though, is the effect that we see that I think of very much as a cybersecurity kind of risk that I think David will probably talk about more, that in the same way as we've seen lots of institutions in the internet environment fail to take adequate measures to protect the security of their users, to protect the security of data that we entrust with them, the platforms have failed to take adequate efforts to understand what it means to create an environment that's trustworthy, that their users can understand, and where political discourse can happen in, I don't want to say an orderly way, but in a way that has the sort of deliberative qualities that Siva's pointing to. And we've got to figure out what balance of legal requirements, changing social conventions, and I think new affordances from the platform we need so that the dialogues that I think are going to continue in these environments can happen in a way that they have as much light as heat. So I'll stop there, and thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you, Jennifer, for having us here. We began the conversation talking about platforms. I suspect we're going to end this conversation with Joan's remarks talking about people. And so I think Danny and I may be a little bit of a bridge in talking about the system. I want to talk in particular about the systems that we have created that have led economically and politically to this moment that we're in right now. You know, I began today thinking about these remarks, wanting to just begin agreeing with Siva, but then I remembered earlier this week when I was in New York, and you know, for all the talk that we have about phone addiction and social media addiction and its negative impacts, these platforms have done the impossible. They have turned New York commuters into Tokyo commuters. Everyone is sitting there silently looking at their phone, and they're so polite. There was an ad right above the person that I was looking at saying, the best part about Facebook isn't on Facebook. I don't know if you've seen these around the T. I imagine you might agree with that as well. But you know, when we talk about this platform, what I want to do here is really try to connect it to two areas that I have a little bit of perspective that are really on the practical side, and that is the economic environment that led us to where we are with platforms like, but not exclusively, Facebook. And then secondly, to think a little bit about the national security and foreign policy angles on all of this, because I think if we look to both of those, the refrain we might get, if we really look back, is that we really should have seen this coming, and that we, if not have seen this before, and seen it before play out in places actually that aren't the United States, there has been this consistent anxiety that maybe we as a country in the United States weren't listening carefully enough to the likelihood that it was going to take place. Danny already mentioned the incredible contrast that we have between President Obama and President Trump on so many things, and yet if you were to engage both of them on the significance of the internet, let me just use the example that I know the most closely. All of you know that Barack Obama cares a great deal about net neutrality, right? He cut a video about it. He made these great regulations, very significant regulations on net neutrality. The reason Barack Obama said as early as before he was even the nominee, I'd take a back seat to no one on net neutrality. If you really press that and you look at the interviews that he's done on this issue, is because of that fundamental belief that without this platform, he would have been unable to organize, not necessarily deliberate, but to actually build the momentum that he had. And so in addition to just being a feel-good notion about disintermediation and about being able to get your voice out there, there's a real conviction that translates into policy outcomes about fundamental things about the way in which our, among other things, telecommunications policy is structured in the United States that have to do with this notion of getting speech out there and the freedom thereupon. And I would argue that, while the rumors of the death of disintermediation, I think, have been largely exaggerated, we all say that, now maybe we should get back to an area where we have better editors because we've seen the blob and we don't love what it looks like. And that's fair. Twitter's a cesspool, and yet I'm on it all the time. This is true, and yet, again, if you go and talk to Donald Trump about what he and his campaign felt the value of this platform was, whatever you think of Donald Trump as an individual, again, the reality is he would argue it was a success, it was a triumph of that disintermediation, the ability to communicate directly with large audiences. And the key further delta, I would suggest, the key further evolution of terminology here I think we need to think about is whether or not the American public is now in a position to essentially regard being informed as having deliberated. I think about how I use Twitter. I think about how I use Facebook. I look at all these platforms. I fundamentally use a lot of them as news aggregators. I think that's because I'm an old person. I don't actually engage as much as what would be a more valuable user on some of these platforms right now. And as I think about that, much of what I do reflects a lot of what other people do if they're not active in engagement, and that is the receipt mode. And part of the reason why I think we are so focused right now on this notion of these algorithms, and rightly so, and how they prioritize information and what we see, is because we have sought to use that idea of ingestion of a huge amount of political and other information as a substitute for what would otherwise be engagement with those around us. In other words, the reason Facebook is trying to push us to the best things on Facebook not happening on Facebook is a recognition that social engagement and political engagement that is limited there too is ultimately somewhat hollow. And I think if you actually look at some of the changes that have happened on the platform in the last couple of, really 6 months, I don't want to focus too much on Facebook, but the other interesting, deleterious, so to speak, effect of these changes that Siva mentioned earlier to the news feed and what is presented to you has actually been a deprioritization of legitimate news. I mean, this is a big contrast. When you think about what's happening day to day and you look at what Facebook has said they're doing about issues like the fake news problem and foreign propaganda and others, you would think intuitively that the effect has been to promote quote-unquote legitimate journalism. But instead, we have actually engaged in this over-problematization of the issue that suggests that there is no one on earth that could possibly be an arbiter of what should be deemed legitimate news, combined with a very real economic imperative to ultimately have the platform be as engaging as possible. And the net effect of that, at the end of the day, was to deprioritize all news, fake and really mostly legitimate, from what folks are seeing in their day-to-day platform. And the reason I bring that up is because what is fundamentally driving Facebook, we all have to recognize, is the same thing that is driving any publicly traded company in the United States, and that is the maximization of shareholder value. And the political environment that has now been given a sort of Facebook-colored tinge is one that was fundamentally designed to have one killer app, and that was the micro-segmentation of populations at a level that was more effective than TV. Right? Everybody's watching the same TV show at the same time in the same geography. That was valuable advertising dollars. And the success, the primacy of Facebook and Google, these were not foregone conclusions. The question of how would Google make money was a salient one 15 years ago. It was not entirely clear. The idea that you could have the scale that television has, or the breadth and the consistency of readership that newspapers have was not a given. And it was this key feature, this microsegmentation, combined with others, now the scale and network effects as well, that gave Facebook the ability to more effectively monetize ad dollars than television, than newspaper. Now, that's resulted in some things that some of us enjoy, more targeted ads. Some people say that's a good thing. Others feel like that is a major invasion of their privacy. Totally recognize the different perspectives there. And yet we have to recognize that the platform is built around the idea of dividing us. And I mean that first non-pejoratively, of actually breaking us down into smaller segments so that we can be advertised to, and ultimately so that we can discuss with each other. And the challenge, the issue we're dealing with right now, is that these same systems that we have designed to help us, by that virtue of that same design, they do not know how to keep from dividing or ultimately socially hurting us. They have not been designed with that in mind. And the real question, from an economic standpoint, that we need to be asking right now, I would argue, is would Facebook truly, if it were worse at targeting, go back to Facebook or Google pre-machine learning broad implementation eras, would they really be broke? Would they? It is stated as a basic Wall Street tenet of fact that the answer is yes. I'm not 100% sure that that's the case. And therefore, suggestions that any further regulation would ultimately be detrimental, if not mortal, to their business model, I'm not sure if I buy, and I think we need to do more work there. It is absolutely true that Facebook has had real challenges of governance. I mean, remember, it was not many years ago that Mark Zuckerberg got on stage at Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress and said, quote, to think that Facebook had an effect on an election, quote, you'd have to be pretty crazy. And here we are. And yet at the same time, there were thousands of Facebook employees that were focused on monetizing their effects within political advertising, their effects to basically get people to vote. You know, if we were in another era, we would have said, if we were in a newspaper editorial room, we would have said something like, you know, the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That was the old phrase, got on the front page if it happened to be somewhat violent or involve a power outage.
Yeah.
21st century version
Time's
of
up,
this, 21st century of this is, if it enrages, it engages. That is the fundamental transaction around which these systems have been designed. And so,
I had used that.
I know, right? Well, you can, but you get to credit me. The reality here is, look, we have seen this before, though, but we saw it in the imagination of America's political enemies. And that's what I want to close on. This is actually not a new phenomenon. If you go back and you look at what the Russians were saying in their official doctrine on information policy and information security as early as 1998, you would find the concept that the internet and the social layer thereupon is fundamentally designed to disrupt the harmony of the political environment in which we live. If you go back to the Chinese doctrine, which more or less postdates it by about 5 years, up to today, you see notions that have now been refined as high as Xi Jinping's own philosophy, which he characterizes as cyber sovereignty. At the time, it was information security or the notion of Chinese netizenry. This idea that the information space is itself somewhat sovereign and should reflect the political environment in which we live. This was a view that was a mainstream view. And if you look to why governments in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others were so perturbed by the color revolutions, much of which were stoked by, among other things, Twitter, part of the reason was this notion of the imposition of a different political environment to theirs. Now, this is said with no necessary judgment of one system to another, although I happen to have my preferences. But if we really look at it, the truth is that the Russians and the Chinese and others would argue that the information environment was chipping away by virtue of its design, of its openness, of its interoperability, of its global nature, at the political environments that they had worked so carefully and diligently to establish. The only difference was that here in the United States, we had the incredible luxury that the architecture of the internet happened to reflect the architecture of our democracy. And so for quite a while, it actually didn't affect us all that much, and it didn't seem anomalous. And now that foreign powers, among others, have sought to actually disrupt that, are we looking more critically at these platforms and looking at the way in which maybe they aren't just a reflection of us, but actually seeking to shape the environment in which we are? And so with that, I'd like to turn it over. Thank you very much.
I brought slides because I couldn't be assured that any of you had been visiting far-right websites in the past week. So I've got some memes and some things I want to talk about. Any punks in the house? No? Society System Decontrol is an old Boston punk band. And I was like, oh, I give a lot of talks, but this kind of fits for Boston. They have a 7-inch that came out in the 80s called The Kids Will Have Their Say. And it sort of reminds me of a time on the internet that I'm still very teary-eyed for, moments of downloading music late at night on SoulSeek, chatting with friends, browsing their libraries of music, and waiting literally days for MP3s to download. And I'll tell you, on my iPhone now, I don't have an MP3 like past maybe 2004 as a result of that, because I can't figure out how to buy MP3s legally and then load them into this system. They want to erase all my things. If I want to load things in, it's very difficult to work with. So my name's Joan. I work at the Data and Society Research Institute in New York City. We have a bunch of reports out right now. One is on the oxygen of amplification, and we look at how far-right media manipulators were able to work as adversarial media against journalists in the 2016 election. It's got a lot of tips and tricks for reporters. Dead Reckoning, Navigating Content Moderation After Fake News is our attempt to, I mean, Charlton's here, so there's no better book on content moderation than Custodians of the Internet. But if you want something shorter, read Dead Reckoning. But big support for that book. Searching for Alternative Facts, Francesca Tripodi spent a year in the field looking at how conservatives read the news and understand media bias. And she looked at how they search for news online, and it's a really impactful study that even conservatives will love. Algorithmic Accountability Primer, we wrote this for Congress. It's written really for undergraduates to understand what happens when we apply algorithms to decision making. And then we've got a new report dropping on Tuesday. That was like my mixtape sound, right? Of Tuesday, new report. Alternative influence, looking at how the reactionary right uses YouTube to broadcast extremist ideas, using very similar ways in which brands sell you things online, very similar techniques. So let's jump into the presentation. Society, you know what it is. Am I right? It's built on social institutions. And we have this notion that with these social institutions, they remain rather stable, predictable, and interlocking so that democracy can happen at scale. And at different points in history, social institutions can have outside effects on society or democracy. And so today, I'll address technology's impact on democracy. But keep in mind that democracy needs all of these institutions to work. And I'll also address how social movements have been utilizing technology to put their ideas and messages on the table. And I guess I'll do that with two caveats. One is Michael Brown was murdered, right? Not just killed. Michael Brown was murdered. And Martin Luther King didn't have a computer. So when we talk about that things happen and the internet is the driver of social change, we also have to keep in our hearts and minds that real social outrage at the end of this, people exist, people make things happen, people make the content. My favorite industry term is user-generated content, right? Because what they really want to do is make a space for circulating content that's been vetted, that's been sanitized and made to fit or sold to fit. And so some of the times that I worry about this fake news crisis, I worry if we're really just trying to rescue a social institution that is troubled by user-generated content. So, which is the stuff that I actually love about the internet. System, you know what it is. In Siva's book, he refers in each chapter to social media as a kind of machine. And so when we think about referring to a system or referring to social media as a machine, we're thinking about it as a purposely constructed technology that allows its operators to act upon objects, us, data, content, with amplified technological force. And these systems create relationships between us and social institutions. And so not only should we look at social media as a social system, but we also should look at what it does to, as you point out, mobilize society or to make society possible. So in my 2011-2012 study of information communication networks built by protesters, I was very fascinated by the way that the internet enabled what I called rhizomatic communication. Multiple channels for collecting, sorting, collating, and broadcasting information for the purpose of coordinating action. One of the main takeaways from my dissertation work is that all of these things happen at once, and no one system or no one piece or no component of this communication infrastructure determines the shape and structure of the movement. All of these things happen at once. If a Twitter account or Twitter accounts get deleted, it's okay. People are still overlapping and overlaying and sharing information in other spaces. And at this time, also Tumblr. I know, death knell, right? Tumblr was a thing. Anyway, so one of the things that I want to bring to your attention, though, is this notion of meme magic and the way in which we circulate information in these really compact JPEGs. The thing about JPEGs that I love is that they're ridiculously hard to edit, right? So JPEGs and memes travel both with the message and the imagery intact. And then this is one of the ways in which my research team at Data and Society studies online participatory culture. These are two memes that were used to promote the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. If you know what they represent, you can see within the one with the red and white banners, there are memes within memes. There's Peppies and Wojaks in there. And then with the Join or Die meme, each one of these pieces represent a flag of a far-right group. So we have the Kekistani group, the anti-communist group, and National Socialists, and then at the head of the snake is the alt-right. And this uniting of the right was something that was made possible because these groups found affiliations amongst each other during what I call the moment of the MAGA coalition, that is the broad bringing together of far-right and extremist ideologies underneath the Trump platform. I can't say platform without also citing Tarleton. Thanks for writing everything. But, you know, platform has at least a dual valence. We can argue about the specificity of all four definitions. But dual valence in the sense that politicians have a political platform. And then we refer to these technology products themselves as platforms, as technological and computational infrastructures.
Can you point out where Peppy the Frog is in that?
Oh, he's a soldier right in the front. But meme magic is also used to share and spread information and political communication. Dank meme factories belonging to Bernie Sanders were an important feature of the 2016 election. And I would argue that Hillary Clinton's failure to move beyond the kind of digital postcard made her kind of unintelligible and not really that interesting. And I could show you, you know, dozens of Trump memes, but I'll save you the time. But this is also the Bernie Sanders punk rack. You know, like if you know, these were all made into T-shirts, and lots of people had them. So lastly, let me end with this notion of decontrol, which is to say, we're not just living through a moment of deregulation, we're moving through a moment of decontrol. And tech has really no accountability to the public sphere. We've all watched these comical Congress, hearings. I don't know. Is anybody listening? Right? I mean, I don't know what's going on there. I really don't. And I actually know some of the smartest people in the world are advising these Congress people, but they seem to be so enamored by having access to what feels like royalty in some weird way. And the moment of decontrol, is happening in the sense that you're right to point out that we've been made into markets. And this moment of adversarial media isn't just about fake news, it's about whose news matters the most. So we've been tracking how groups coordinate to feed false information to journalists and experts, usually during times of crisis. And here are two disinformation collages that were put into journalists' Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds so that they would name the wrong murderer in the Charlottesville car attack. And we tracked this meme all the way back to, obviously, 4chan, if you know what that is. But it's a space online, a message board that's been going on for many years where trolls have fairly unmoderated conversation, but they also organize troll campaigns in order to trick the media. And then we can go on and talk about adversarial media related to the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. In this instance, they purchased ads that they targeted to people within 10 miles of New York City, gathered data and metadata on 30,000 respondents that said that they were going to attend this Not My President protest. They also used promoted posts to put 2 protests across the street from one another in Texas. And here's a picture where someone posted on their social media that they had showed up to challenge the white supremacists who were protesting in front of this mosque. And if you can see that cross on the back there, that is a dog whistle and a telltale sign of white supremacist organizing. So in the end, today, Ellen Pao, from the former CEO of Reddit, basically, I don't know if I'm going to have a job after this, but she just basically said taking down shitty content works, and research supports it. And her main takeaway from this was that these CEOs shouldn't be treated like royalty. They shouldn't be treated like naive boys. They shouldn't be treated as if they don't have the power to do something, to change something that I think is fundamental to getting back the stability of our social institutions, but also remembering that we need to hold out a space for movements and user-generated content so that we can still continue to communicate with each other. But all is not lost if we have 17 Twitters. I'm sorry, but if we have 17 Twitters, like, I will start 18 Twitter, right? That's fine. There are 8chan boards, you know, like, we can have as many as we want. And I think we need to decentralize. And I know I'm over time, but I'm going to totally end on this note. I'm going to keep saying we're going to end to trick you, because you're in Althusserian hell where, like, everything is ideology and manipulation now. But I'll end with this, which is just to say that Tocqueville recognized that the problem of democracy and the solution to holding on to democracy is this notion of centralization. And he talks a lot about how administrative centralization is a real problem of governance. And if we want the internet back, then we actually do need to decentralize. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for terrific and lively presentations. We have time for the panelists to respond to one another directly before I maybe ask a question or two, and then we open things up. Would anyone like to get us started from the panel?
One order? All right.
Feel free.
Yeah, so this was a really good mix of insights and narratives that I think added a number of layers to our conversation. I actually think, you know, we all had a very short time to lay our case out. I would like to push beyond the boundaries that we were able to lay out. So, for instance, you know, Dan told I think the beginning of the story that I know you wanted to get deeper on. You know, 57 channels and nothing on was the case. It's not just 57 channels. They were all old white men speaking on those 57 channels, right? So we had a media ecosystem in this country and in much of the world in which large segments of our society and of the world had no voice and no ability to organize collectively or tell their own story in a way that might reach beyond the people who are experiencing their experiences directly. So that was a problem we needed to solve. That was a problem we did a really good job at solving. I might argue too good a job until, maybe not too good a job, but things shifted in the wrong direction at a very important time. So I would say that what we have reached is not necessarily a moment of diversity. We blew past diversity to cacophony. And we're at a moment of cacophony so that every expression is one of indignation, and every echo of that expression bounces off walls. So we're not a bunch of calm people talking through issues in a coffee house in Vienna. We're in a really loud dance club and everybody's screaming. Everybody's yelling. Everybody's yelling, the roof is on fire. No, I'm kidding. That would be trite, and that dates me. So, but look, we've also reached a point of cacophony through which we cannot engage in a meaningful discussion about making choices in the world that we must make. So in 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire outside of Cleveland. It caught on fire at a moment, it was about 10 years after the environmental movement in this country really solidified, wrote its treatises, put forth an agenda, and steadily had moved to capture the attention of the public. And it was a hard slog for those 10 years. Then the river catches on fire. It's on the nightly news every night. Within 3 years, this country passed a Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, established the Environmental Protection Agency under a Republican president. At that point, during those 3 years, we had a debate, how do we move forward? Should we have market-based responses to this catastrophe of polluted water? Should we have state-based regulation as a response to this catastrophe? Should we just rely on litigation, lawsuits, et cetera? What's the best toolkit to go forward? And we decided on a hybrid set of solutions, but we made some serious progress, and we had a healthy debate about where to go forward. And that debate continues to this day, although actually I think we've stopped debating it, and now we've just dismantled the EPA. That's a whole other story. Okay. But no one in 1969 stood up and screamed, I don't believe that the river's on fire. Right? Now the whole world is on fire, and we can't even get to step 2. We can't even get to step 2 to figure out how to address this most crucial of questions, because we keep getting waylaid by the cacophony, by the hecklers. Everything is subject to a heckler's veto now. There are structural reasons for this. There are political economy reasons for this. There are cultural reasons for this. But it's all bad, and we really need to fix it. So addressing problems with the political economy of media, social media specifically, is crucial. Addressing problems with our regulatory structure and our incentive structures that flow from it is crucial. But fundamentally, we have to remember, the reason we have free speech does not have anything to do originally with Robert Mapplethorpe, which was, a lovely side effect of having free speech in this country. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with the fact that one day we decided pornography is acceptable. That was a side effect of it. We have a First Amendment so that we can have open and frank discussions about public issues. That's why Madison and Jefferson thought it was an important thing to do. That and protecting religions from the state. But, that's fundamentally it. So that is the first principle. And the constant invocation of a heckler's veto in various forms has basically undermined our ability to think. We cannot think collectively. So that's how we have to approach these programs, these interventions. What can we do so that we can get together and think and actually solve some problems?
Other panelists who want to jump in with a question or comment in response?
I just want to say to Tocqueville, who I love, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin at the same time said we need a national post system, right? He was the first postmaster general, this. So we kind of did the same, we did these two seemingly opposite things in tension as we built up early democracy. And I'm not sure how far I want to go in saying that's our nirvana that we're trying to go back to. But I think we've always lived with this tension of decentralized systems, which I think are really important. That's the way the web started. It built on top of it a whole set of centralizing functions without losing the underlying decentralization. I sometimes think there's two things we don't know, I think, enough about that system. Some part is the kind of work that you do. We don't know enough about the actual dynamics of information effects in that system. And I think it's very easy to look back at 2016 and sort of focus on the media aspect of 2016. I think there was a bunch of other stuff. I think there was, and I don't know that I believe, I don't think anyone has made the case, put it this way, that there's anything about the structure of social media, the advertising, the privacy, all of which needs to be fixed, which determined the result of that election. I don't think we know that, and I'm not sure it's really knowable. So I think we're sort of stuck in this need to maintain, for Siva's purpose of being deliberative, some collective function that brings the world together, brings the country together, and that's what Ben Franklin wanted to do with the post roads. He thought that was the ultimate way to build a democracy and build a national economy, right, was to have post roads, which was revolutionary. It was as revolutionary as the internet, as compared to what sort of similar countries were doing. But at the same time, you know, we had a lot of decentralizing forces that people held on to, and I guess I think to really make those choices well, we do have to partly be guided by First Amendment principles, because it's kind of what we have. But I also think we need to understand an awful lot more about the nitty-gritty of the dynamics of the information flow in these environments as it affects the deliberative process. And I just don't think we know anywhere near enough about it. And I think policymakers really suffer from not knowing that. And not being able to make good, you know, the next set of media policy choices are going to be choices that are going to be driven somehow or another by what we think about how our media environment shapes our democracy and the kind of the economy around it. And the frustrating thing to me about those hearings was that it was a fact-free zone and it was a research-free zone. So there's a lot to do there.
Well, we do know a lot, but by we, I mean social media scholars. Like the community of scholars that Joan and I operate in have been doing this work solidly, methodically for more than a decade. None of us have been surprised by anything we've seen in the last 36 months. Nothing.
Yeah, and I guess I jump in, and Sasha's Kostanjichak's here, so, you know, your work too has been really influential in understanding that it's, the centralization thesis has been a kind of problem space that we've been trying to think through, and glomming onto the notion that Twitter is a public sphere. That feels good in some ways to say, because you're like, okay, now we have a logics and a rules. But really, it's like the analogy I like to use is it's McDonald's at 2 a.m. Like, you can get kicked out. There are rules. You have to buy a product. If not, you are the product, right? And like, it's just not a completely unmediated space, and neither is the public square. Right. And I also think that there are rules of amplification and ways in which we've learned to modulate volume and sound that we could bring to this discussion to move us away from debates about, is it free speech or is it not free speech? Because to be honest with you, any one of you could stand up right now and have the freest speech of all, but I have a microphone, right? And so when we start to think through these systems, I'm starting to move away from even trying to theorize it as a product of speech, because the cacophony, that moment of volume, is so perplexing and so overwhelming that, you know, in order to find your way through it and out of it, requires you to bring the crowd, right? And so movements become a really important way that we can understand volume and density, so that we can understand what issues are important to pay attention to. And overwhelmingly, what was put on the table in 2016 was as a glitch, was that the crowd could be bought, and that you could use SEO, you could use a combination of purchasing products on Facebook in order to be louder than everyone else. And to me, that was the problem that we're going to reckon with until there is some kind of regulation in this space.
I would just say that, so I think there's, I by all that, I think there is still a major gap in getting those insights into the policy debate. In 2011 and 2012, we had a major national debate about consumer online privacy. None of this came up. None of it. And it should have.
We were trying.
Right. Well,
Let me tell you something else that happened in 2012. Look,
and I would say that I think there was a lot of good advocacy and analysis of what privacy ought to mean, but I don't think we got down to this point. So maybe it was, and I think we need to.
There's an opportunity here to kind of rescue ourselves from this. I sort of sensed a kind of collective political fatalism about this moment that we're in. I mean, we said we're in a moment of deregulation. Tech has no accountability. And I think you hear that refrain over and over again. There's no accountability. There's no regulation. The hearings were worthless. There was no content to it. And I think it's worth taking a little step back and recognizing
YouTube got a pass.
YouTube got a pass.
Remember that.
Google broadly has gotten a pass over this moment. And actually, that segues to the point I wanted to get at, which is something really interesting is happening here in internet and technology policy. You know, Danny mentioned the work that had been done over the course of a decade plus to try to get to a moment of consumer privacy recognition where the broad public, you look at the polling, 9 out of 10 Americans feel like they have lost control over their data. And yet 1 out of 10 Americans has severed a relationship with a company on the basis of them losing their data. Now, there's more we're learning about consumers getting more and more empowered, but I think one of the conclusions we maybe need to think about drawing here is that the collective freakout that we have experienced in this issue might not have to do with privacy. Personal theory here, but why is it, we have to ask ourselves, that this issue, that we're having these panels, there are a lot of these panels happening right now. You can go to like any university, any major campus, not this good right now with these guys, but this is a conversation that is in the mainstream all the time. Why? Why not the other things that are happening? Why, for instance, is this, which is implicitly tied to, let's say Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, the Trump campaign, and the Russia scandal, all of those things combined somehow are sticking to this president in at least the national media's attention in a way that other major issues have not. And my contention is that actually doesn't have to do with privacy. Not because there isn't a privacy violation taking place here, but because for some reason that issue has not resonated in the American political consciousness.
Privacy almost never has to do with privacy.
Very true. So maybe we need new branding for it. But what I'm trying to get at here is that this idea that tech has no accountability. Well, Facebook stock is down 26%. 26%, I just checked under the table, from where it was at its high a couple of months ago. And if you go and you read the analyst reports about why Facebook stock is down an ungodly amount, when you think about this as an almost $1 trillion company, the reason is partly, if not significantly, depending on your analyst, regulatory exposure. Regulatory exposure. Laws don't happen in a heartbeat. Enforcement actions, even if you violate, for instance, a Federal Trade Commission consent decree, hypothetically, those don't happen in a heartbeat. What happens is ultimately the development of a public groundswell that leads, in some cases, not all, but to a series of overlapping actions combining investigations, media attention, public outcry, and then some form of regulation. Not always, absolutely not always. But I think the issue that we need to look at here is not that we are at a moment of the impossibility of regulation of these behemoths. There's an interesting and separate question to be had about are these companies too big to regulate, and that some have compellingly argued that that makes it almost impossible. I'm not so sure, because I think those that are saying the fact that we don't have a sort of reconsideration of the Section 230 moment of that deal, that we don't have these strong regulations that are coming out immediately as a result of foreign manipulation, to me reflects the fact that we have as a society have not figured out what's wrong with these platforms. We know there's something wrong. We know there are a lot of things that are wrong, but we don't know whether we want political speech and ads and transparency fixed. We don't know whether we want foreign influence fixed. We don't know whether we want the deliberative moment fixed so that these are more thoughtful platforms. The segmentation of populations, which one is it? Maybe all of them, and maybe that gets to something deeper in the business model, but I can't help but think every time we have this conversation of going back and reading the early political statements that were said about television at its inception, right? The vast wastelands, going back to radio, going back to the written word. And there is always a sense of collective longing for the day just beyond memory when politicians were honest and discourse was civil. And I want to make sure that as we're pointing out what's wrong with these platforms, of which there are a great many things, that we actually know collectively what we're doing. Because I think there are a lot of folks in Washington, D.C., I know many of them, Danny does too, a lot of you do too, that are actually interested in answering that question in a regulatory way right now, but they don't really have a compass, because I don't know that we have given them one or given the public an empowering sense that they get to have an opinion that is technically informed, but for work like the work that we've heard about today, which I think is a really useful way towards that.
Well, let's also
So-
remember that we're at a moment when policy itself is pretty much suspended in this country for at least 2 more years, right? We cannot have serious
2
policy
months,
discussions.
2 months, just 2 months.
You know, I don't even know if flipping both houses would instigate a moment of policy analysis, which often has to happen in the executive branch, frankly, right? So, yeah, we're stifled for probably. Let's hope it's shorter than 2 years. You never know, right?
What about
But
state attorneys general? The FTC, enforcement actions,
FTC
Europe,
is
GDPR.
anything under the executive branch is incapable of serious study right now. It's because there are too many rocks being thrown everywhere. But anyway, it's a longer conversation. I would also point out that Facebook's stock dropped heavily right after my book came out. So
Market moving advantage,
One
people.
man
never
wrecking
know.
crew.
What are you working on next? Got any tips?
So if I can jump here as the moderator to this extremely lively conversation, I mean, when I hear about fake news, the 2016 election, extremist behavior, I'm personally overwhelmed, and I am wondering, what do we do, right? We've got 4 great people on the panel. Maybe they can give us some constructive advice for ourselves as citizens. But this is actually, what can I do as an educator at a place like MIT, where we're training the next generation of platform builders? Is there something we could be doing differently that might yield a better outcome in the longer term? Pick one of those questions to answer and enlighten me.
Let me just do a small one on the education context. I think despite heroic efforts, exceptional writing, and great research, the academy has somehow failed to empower the general public to feel like they're entitled to an opinion about anything plus technology. And one person agrees with me, which is more than I usually get. And again, I think there's a real opportunity. I considered a lot of my job when I was in the government explaining tech to people who were deeply afraid of technology but had no reason to be. And we see parallels to this. I mean, in the national security environment, the aversion people had in the policy space and the general public to really thinking about the details of nuclear weaponry were quite profound for the first 6 to 10 years of the nuclear era. And then people kind of figured out how they worked, and they kind of got broader opinions, and then you had folks that actually started writing quite compellingly, connecting narrative to the science of how you'd actually be able to conduct a war post-nuclear science. And actually we ended up in a place where people felt like, I don't have to build a bomb in my backyard to have an opinion about nuclear war. That seems totally reasonable to us now. I bet if you go to the average American, well-educated individual who doesn't have a technical background and say, do you feel like you're empowered to really have a view about how transparent Facebook's algorithm should be? But no one has that opinion, I would argue. And so I think we've got a real opportunity of this moment to turn this deep concern into a moment of knowledge, because the reality is, while we here at MIT appropriately complexify this stuff, because it is really complex and really deep, the level of understanding that people need to get it is actually not that deep. There is a lot more education we can do at a, what some people would argue, superficial level, to give people an opportunity to get their voice in there. Now we can get to the question of whether their voice will be heard or whether it will actually get to an effect. But I think until we empower an electorate, you're not going to see this become fundamentally an election issue. You're not going to see smarter senators asking smarter questions, and it's going to be very hard to get to policy outcomes.
Is this talk being streamed anywhere? It's private. It's just between us, right? This is really a boomer problem. I'm sorry, but, the regulators, the people sharing the fake news, nobody new is really signing up for Facebook. We don't see this stuff proliferate as much in other spaces as we do Facebook. CNN wants to rescue its reputation, Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, yada, yada, yada. They're owned by Amazon. Right? And so unless we really invest in local news and look at new ways of doing news, which I've been watching lots of people live streaming town hall meetings and really interesting stuff if you follow some live streamers that do cover local issues and do interesting pieces on restaurants and cool things going on in towns. And and part of that is, one of the injunctions of that indie media moment was to become the media, right? To do with these tools more than just consume. And so I would suggest to teach transmedia education, to teach people how to use these tools that move beyond browsing. And a lot can be learned then and done in media environments where people are, if it is the case that people are going to upload more content to YouTube than there are eyeballs to watch it, maybe we should invest in trying to get people to do good editing and learn these things in school and do some more practice-based arts training. And we also see the big shift in media coming to, one of the reasons why we end up with so much fake news is because reporters are like, hey, was anybody, this is literally something that happened. I am getting dragged online by trolls. Someone was like, was anybody, there was a very prominent reporter tweeted, was anybody at the shooting in Jacksonville? DM me. And all the trolls were like, I was there. I have a gay black son and stepson. And the media was like, oh, you do? And it's like, no, you are getting trolled by some white supremacist. And I said this to the reporter, and then, of course, the trolls were like, this girl, So, and I have to turn my media on and off. So, social media on and off when they decide that they're going to harass me. But the point is to say that if you want to educate, you got to teach the tools, not just teach about the tools, not just teach about the content. And, this too will pass.
I mean, I share that optimism. I mean, I think we have square in our face like a really relatively horrible set of events, but I don't think those set of events define the entire political environment of the United States or of the whole world. I think there are a lot of great campaigns going on. There's a lot of great activism going on. People are doing exactly what you're talking about. I do think there are two really focused technical problems that we have. One is this problem of actually doing a better job of systematically identifying sources of misinformation that are a result of known patterns of manipulation. And again, I really do think it's a cybersecurity kind of problem where we have to learn to detect these sorts of structural anomalies. How can you tell when it's a troll? You probably know a lot about when it's a troll, but if we do that at the retail level, it's kind of like Alta Vista search. Eventually, we got to PageRank and had a different and more abstract and scalable way of understanding how to look at the web back then, so that people could use it and make it more usable. And I think people can work. I think that's a real problem for people to work on. I think the reason that doesn't happen is that it's not quite demanded by the market. And I do think we have to figure out how to make sure that operators of platforms, large or small, demand tools that help in this deliberative process, the first step of which is filtering out the nonsense. The next step of which is dealing with the genuine cacophony, because I think there is reason for cacophony. I don't always think cacophony is bad, and that's where I will get a little bit back on my First Amendment high horse. I'm not sure who I'm prepared to trust to judge cacophony. I don't want to centralize that too far. I know we've got to do some of it, but I would rather have a somewhat more diverse environment of judging cacophony and let people pick which cacophony they want.
Right, but the problem is...
And I know there's a lot of neoliberal blah, blah, blah in that, but I also think that we live it's the best we've been able to do in a democracy to kind of live with that tension. And I just don't want to go too far to the edge, to the other edge that says we somehow have sources of truth we can point to. That makes me
Well, right now,
nervous, too.
the arbiter we're trusting is YouTube's recommendation algorithm.
No, I think we're trusting a lot of different, in fairness, I don't think there's,
You should search for Federal Reserve then if you want fairness and see what happens. I mean, it's true.
No,
What
I
Chris
get
has
it, I
tweeted
get
is
it.
true. It is a
Right.
garbage.
Right,
It's
and-
garbage information sources
well,
that
but
are
all
being
the other
searched.
searches
Searching
are
video is
fine.
very
That's just a very fraught one.
I mean, well, there is case to be made that YouTube is sort of the worst of the worst. But I should also say that they have a social graph. Like, I just have my account. I got my friends, I got my account, you know, and people figure this stuff out, right? There is the great app that is broken now because Twitter changed its API called Block Together, where you could block thousands of trolls at once because people figured out that you could do it. In their social graph, they don't use really any of that data to help us out, right? Only
Yes.
recently have quality filters been applied, and my life is getting better as a result. Quality's up. But I should say that in using the social graph, it's very easy to spot these networks. They all talk to each other.
So I'm going to cut the panel off because we
No,
can
you're
just
not.
talk amongst ourselves the whole night. But there's some fabulous people in the audience from around MIT and Microsoft Research and other places, and I know you have interesting things to ask and to say. So we have one mobile mic that can move around the room, or please approach one of the mics and ask the panelists what you want. Sasha.
Hi, I'm Sasha Costanza-Chalk. I'm Associate Professor of Civic Media here at MIT and CMSW. Wonderful panel, thank you so much. I wanted to bring up another potential mechanism for addressing some of the challenges that didn't come up on the panel, which is the sort of interestingly growing tech worker movement, largely under the hashtag banner Tech Won't Build It, that we've seen over the summer and now into the beginning of the fall. Some really interesting developments where the first big one that got a lot of visibility was Google's Project Maven. AI for Drone Warfare project was at least publicly, they talk about it as canceled, in large part based on the efforts of Google workers themselves saying that they wouldn't work on this type of project, and a lot of scholars and scientists also signing on their support. We've seen with the crisis of children being taken away from their parents and the Keep Families Together movement, we've seen a lot of pressure on Microsoft. Microsoft's Azure has a cloud contract with ICE to manage some of their data and communication systems, and we've seen a push for Tech Won't Build It against Microsoft. Same with Amazon, Salesforce, which was doing CRM for Customs and Border Patrol. And so I guess I just wanted that to be on the table, as in addition to the regulatory solutions and the consumer pressures that tech workers themselves, as a very highly skilled and valuable commodity in the information economy, and this being MIT, where we're training the next generation of them, that there is some power there. And most recently, we've also seen a number of tech workers posting publicly on social media their responses to recruiters from companies that are targets of Tech Won't Build It, to say, you're a great company, but I'm not willing to work for you until you cancel this contract with, with ICE, which is separating young children from their families. So the question is, how, this is for all or any of you, how do you see that? Is this an important strategy? Is it marginal and not really that useful? Is it a key and important direction that should be supported and amplified? And what's the role of educators and scholars in amplifying that type of movement? Thanks.
So I think it's a great. I think it's an extraordinary phenomenon, and it's gone on for quite a while. There've been in the early 2000s, a bunch of patent holders had an effort that would essentially have shut down open web standards, and including patent holders at major web companies like Apple and Microsoft and others. And it was engineers at Apple and Microsoft and IBM that stood up and said, we have to keep web standards open. So I think those are really important, and engineers are persnickety and individually minded, so I think they can be counted on to continue to throw wrenches in the gears every once in a while. I'm really interested in the Tech Will Build It side of this, and I think an interesting example that we should encourage and that also bears study is the voting security movement. As you know, a bunch of our colleagues here have put a huge amount of effort into that. And so there's now been a lot of good critique about what makes a bad voting system, which is really important because we have a lot of them and they need to be fixed. Some of that energy is now getting turned into what makes a good voting system, and there are various kind of open source engineering efforts around where people are trying to say, let's build a better voting system so that municipalities and states and whomever else can actually have better tools to work with. So I think both of those are really important, and I think the kind of problems we're talking about here are probably more in the tech will build it category, because users need better tools. We need these environments to be better, right? I mean, that's I think what a lot of people have said. So yeah, I think it's really important.
I think Danny might even undersell the significance of this constituency because it's only become public now. I can't. So in my old job, I had a ton of these big companies and little companies too come in all the time and talk about public policy and what they wanted to happen. I can't tell you how many times, I literally couldn't count, it would be dozens, that huge companies have said that their policy position on a particular matter was something that would be against economic interest. Literally, if they told their shareholders would be puzzled if not upset because, quote, the engineers won't allow it. Or because this is really important to our engineering culture. That's the sort of we will build it side. It's not just about stopping stuff. There's actually quite a lot. If you give just one example, on an issue like I mentioned net neutrality before, there are a lot of companies that might not have any particular economic incentive to be behind net neutrality because they could afford to pay it. But you ask some very influential engineers within that company, and they might tell you something like, well, I feel like it would be eating our seed corn. Right? And the idea that you wouldn't have that broad ecosystem. Big, important stuff is actually influenced by this constituency. And the reason I like this question, Sasha, it's a great question, is because it actually drives something that, for those of us who are sort of cynical about government right now, it's actually a really good thing. Because it shows that even if you believe that the instruments of power are all commercially driven, and it's all lobbying, that means actually the outcomes that get to the table in that lobbying meeting that they get into because they give so much money to these these politicians running in gerrymandered districts, well, that is in turn shaped by the engineers. And that to me is a pretty powerful
If
insight
I
about
may
outcomes.
play Eeyore for a moment, there are limitations to this movement.
There sure are.
Right? And number one is that as Americans, we've pretty much lost our ability to bargain collectively. So the power of those engineers is merely a function of the labor shortage in that field. Mm-hmm. That labor shortage is temporary. It's temporary for two reasons. One, we're producing more engineers all the time. Number two, so is India. So we may have great conversations at MIT, but the Indian Institute of Technology is producing just as many engineers. They are going to work for Facebook and Microsoft and Google and 20 other companies on H-1B visas where they're essentially indentured servants. They cannot make political stands, they cannot go against the grain of their company, or they lose their residence. They lose their ability to be in this country and potentially get a green card and build a future. There's a lot at stake. And as the labor force shifts to indentured servitude, which is one of the major policy goals of these companies, we are going to see a weaker and weaker collective labor force among engineers. That is a serious problem. Again, these are problems that have to be addressed politically outside of that constituency. Right now, 2018, that constituency has significant power, not to be minimized, I think to be respected, to be applauded. But here's the other thing. Engineers, computer scientists are not of one mind. There are people of all sorts of positions on all sorts of issues in that community, from all sorts of backgrounds. We are hearing many of the loudest and the best organized of them, but there are many dissenting voices within that group. So it's not something we want to lay a long-term movement on. There are so many things that can go wrong along the way. No, I'm not. I just said that. Yeah. Oh, yes, I understand that.
They are not good, but because when you say Google actually looks for exceptional people, they think in a very different way. Now you are right that there are different culture for people and they think differently, but the one that they actually, I have met at least here at Google, they are with different money. They are not the loudest, they are the one that actually want to, so there's a balance.
Totally agree, totally
I
agree.
would just, not to go full empirical, but there's this moment that I'm hearing in this tension, which is coworker.org is actually organizing like two very interesting campaigns at once. One has to do with tech won't build it and this notion that, you know, there are people who are not going to work on defense contracts if it means building autonomous weapons that can murder without any, without any human oversight or decision making. The other campaign that they're organizing is mapping the alt-right within Google to understand how LGBT and otherwise identified people are being targeted by other Google employees using Google's Circles infrastructure in order to get at them. And so there's some really interesting tensions in what you're showing here, which is that on the one hand, all companies have their issues because people have different political rationales, but what we do know from the work of Coworker is that Google Circle information and personal information of Google workers was transmitted to known white supremacists who then posted that information online, and that information could have only come from Google employee messaging systems. And so there's a tension here. And I would also say that even in the midst of my broad optimism about tech won't build it and the work of Lily Irani around Mechanical Turk, I'm also tempered with Peter Thiel, right? Palantir will build it, and they'll build it really cheaply, and they'll build it with the exact people that you're talking about. And so there are companies that step into these voids that are different, and this is why I'm putting a bet on academics and journalists and infrastructure companies to think with the notion of FATE, which is fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics, and using Sophia Noble's work as well as yours and others to try to really push CS programs to integrate and understand the ethical value of building these tools and what the social impacts could be.
Susan.
My name is Susan Silby. I'm a professor of anthropology and sociology here at MIT. One of our colleagues said to me some years ago, I thought I saw him, I think might still be in the audience, that my students can build anything. They can do anything. But all they can say is awesome. They can't differentiate what's awesome from what's not awesome. Can you help us? Question to the anthropologist was, can you come and help us understand this culture which can build anything but has no idea what for or what not for? And your comments, Jen's asking what can education do, and your reference to that it's an academic responsibility, I think is absolutely right. Because the technology we build is not something external that works on society. This didn't come from nowhere. There are lots of precursors to this virus. And I consider FATE, this is my personal opinion, is just like a little piece, a virus is a little piece of DNA. And it enters in and it corrupts the existing one because it's very much like it and it latches onto it. And so what do we have here? You use the word, and everybody does, social media. Social. There's nothing social about it. Thank you, Joan, for your wonderful little remarks there. Social means we have a meaning, and it's not personal. It's knowledge over centuries. Social means taking account of another. That's what the word means. Interacting by taking account of another. Well, how can you take account of another who you don't know who they are? You can't see them, they don't give their name, and yet we call this social media. And you worry, or you're surprised that it's a cacophony. It's not a conversation because a conversation is organized. There are norms. One person talks, and the other stops and listens, and then the other answers. But there are no norms here because I hazard a hypothesis that this technology was built, like most, with the habits and preferences of the engineers who built it. Let that sink in for a little bit. The ones who built it were, like my good friend Danny, they don't trust institutions very much. They don't trust norms. It all should be a relatively free space. Well, we didn't get here. Here means the 20th or 21st century by everybody doing what makes each one of them feel good. People paid a price for pursuing their self-interest. We've now built a world where there's no price for pursuing your self-interest. In fact, that's considered the highest value. And this is the consequence of 200 or 300 years of individualism. Rabid individualism. And so the institutions are sort of down, the institutions that Joan listed some, and the individual is here. And you talk about attention. Of course there's attention. There's always attention. But it's now become unbalanced by a multiplicity of forces. The market, ideologies of the self, psychology, even TV, advertising, statistics, and it all has come to fruition when we built something. We just sent out a little virus. Oh, we can't trust institutions. They are gatekeepers. They're keeping everybody out. Well, now you have a normless world. The fear of anomie, you've got cacophony. And to me, it's not unexpected. If you listen to what was driving it.
That's right.
Can't trust anybody, have to make it completely open because somebody might punish you.
That's right.
You got the world you asked for.
Thank you. So yesterday I was at, there's another university in Cambridge, and I was speaking there. And
Don't trust that.
an undergraduate in that college said that college has put out a series of messages to undergraduates that they too can be the next Mark Zuckerberg. And I said, does that mean they want you to drop out? And I was alarmed by this, right? I mean, this is a university with a number of influential graduates. Why they would pick one of the non-graduates to celebrate as the role model and the hero? They could have picked another of the non-graduates who's also perhaps done much more good in the world and less damage in the world. And I said, there are Harvard College graduates working in the Rio Grande Valley, helping to reunify families. Why can't they celebrate that person, right? It just takes a little bit of digging to find out who that person is. There are Harvard College graduates who are working in family counseling, right? There are Harvard College graduates who are working to clean water in parts of the world that desperately need clean water, like Michigan, right? So I find that celebration of the accomplishment, where Mark Zuckerberg, for all his brilliance, just managed to do what he did at the right time, in the right place, with the right support and the right mentors and the right backers and the right investors. A tremendous number of things went right for that guy. He was born lucky too, that helps. But it was a really bizarre moment to think that is the story we are putting forth as a definition of success and contribution. And that's not to take anything away from his success and contribution. But there are
We
so
are
many
going to
better
remember
stories
that
we're
he
not
took
telling.
that from other people. He stole it.
I don't know about that. I wouldn't actually go there. Yeah.
Okay.
But thank you.
So we've had somebody waiting here very patiently to ask a question. Let me give you the floor.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ben Decker. I'm a research fellow at the other college in Cambridge. So I apologize if anything I say is just weak, baseless, and inferior to every other bit of discussion that's been had, because that was really incredible. And I think this understanding and this attempted self-awareness, or this idea that we are building things that we want in our own image or in a image. Getting into like a direct kind of breaking news use case, while we were kind of sitting here, also apologies for being the guy with the man bun to bring up conspiracies, but Joan, at the end of your presentation, you sort of referenced Reddit and this sort of concept of deplatforming content or ideas or sources. This afternoon, the main QAnon space on Reddit was officially kind of shut down and deplatformed. Now, as kind of an aggressively multi-platformed conspiracy community, where you have the anonymous forums, you have Reddit, you have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have the main QAnon pub website, which I believe similar web traffic recently was like 7 million users a month. You had the apps on iPhone and Android trending in the paid entertainment sections for a while. Making that decision independently by Reddit, I mean, what does that mean for the next week on the rest of the platforms for this conspiracy community, and I mean, frankly, all the less conversational ones at this point with much smaller communities? Because with QAnon, how much of that community is actually getting it from Reddit? Is that action actually of social value moving forward? Or does it increase the volume of the music and everyone shouting much larger that the roof is flown halfway across the world by now because of Hurricane Florence? So I don't know. I mean,
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so the deplatforming, no platforming, depersoning, all of the ways in which we talk about how can you take something offline, and there's always archive.org to save the day, right? The Wayback Machine tells all your secrets, no matter what. And so, but the ability to post and generate new content, what's interesting about the QAnon phenomena is that, and if you're not familiar with it, there's a deep state conspiracy. Trump's in on it, Mueller's in on it. They're going to arrest Hillary. She's running a pedo ring, but it's not the same one that was at the Comet Ping Pong. It's a different one. It might be in Arizona. We don't know. It might be in the desert. Stay tuned. Follow the breadcrumbs. Literally follow the breadcrumbs. And the QAnon posts, where they start from on 4chan and 8chan, which is this sort of historically lulzy message board community, it was kind of an obvious lulzy prank, and people started picking up, iterating on it, talking about it. It's transferred across all of these different platforms. But I think that there's something to be learned from what happened in the week after Charlottesville. All of these companies acting not together, but in concert, removed many different accounts of known white supremacists and organizers of the Unite the Right rally. Everything from Airbnb to Uber to OkCupid. We had GoDaddy, we had Google, Facebook. They all started taking down this content en masse. And it has been impossible for some of these sites to rebuild. Other sites that have more tenacious sysadmins and hackers at their helm are able to regenerate in some way, but not at the strength they once were. And so my hope with something like this that happened with Alex Jones too is that Reddit does it first, and then tomorrow something else happens, and the next day something else happens. Because these companies tend to like to fly under the cover of one another. And I think that this is a broad reason why YouTube gets such a pass for spreading extremist content, because they're hiding underneath Google, who's saying, we're not a platform, guys. We're scientific about our search, right? But in some ways, YouTube is a hybrid social media product. And so insofar as no platforming works, it only works when you can remove from these very big public platforms the content. And then there's always going to be pockets and places that this stuff will circulate, especially I'm thinking here about Gab, which is a social media platform that really jumped into the line of sight right after Unite the Right rally. It was like, we'll take anyone, anything. And it is a cesspool of white supremacist nonsense. And nobody can use it, but everyone's trying to defend it, right? But they won't go on it because it's so toxic. And again, like pressure on Microsoft Azure, the cloud services, is making it so that they actually have to move all of their hosting off of this cloud service platform because the cloud service is saying our terms of service, our content moderation matters. And so I think we're going to see more and more of this, but I think it's slowly going to move down the stack. And I think that cloud service companies, domain registrars, and ISPs are going to be the tail of the tape when it comes to removing this stuff, not permanently, but for the time being.
So let's see if we can get in the last two questions before we have to break. Over to you.
Yeah, mine's a quick question. I don't work in this field, and so I think this is super interesting. A couple of you mentioned that having 18 Twitters could be a workable solution, something you'd be comfortable with. Could you talk us through what would that look like? What would a world look like under that potential solution that you would be happy with?
Well, in some instances, being on platforms, it's really just a matter of preference about how you like that content to look, right? If you could set your Facebook social media to be like, I'm only going to see people who post, things less than, 100 words, right? I have a very, my family likes to chat, right? So there's a lot of talk. But if you could set things like that, then people might be able to create features on different social media, and people obviously have their preferred platforms. But you could imagine a space in which the terms of service and the content moderation acted very differently. For instance, I would love a YouTube that was sort of one and done. YouTube has this really ornate 3 strikes policy where you can get a take back and a mulligan, and you can get a strike, and then if you have a broker or a booker or an agent, they can get that strike removed. And it's really complicated, and as a result, completely impossible to enforce. And the moment that you get 2 strikes, then you move to someone else's channel, and they loan you that, but then you pay them in your viewers, but they give you the money from the super chats. And so what I'm saying is, ultimately, that all of these companies have different terms of service, and you could imagine a space and a place where there were versions of Twitter that served particular kinds of subcultures or interests, or and we refer to these things that happen on Twitter that are quasi-open as phenomenon like journalist Twitter or Black Twitter, where there are conversations and groups and networks of people. Not to say they're unharmed by harassment, but to say that they do build their community and then also enforce their own boundaries in different ways. And there's a lot of shunning that can go on in those spaces as well.
Well, we do actually have multiple services that do Twitter-like activities. Some of them are much worse than Twitter. I would say most of them are much worse than Twitter in terms of experiences. But look, I'm not sure I have a number of Twitters I would like, but I'm not actually that worried about Twitter. Twitter has about 300 million accounts. We assume most of those are humans. And Facebook has 2.2 billion accounts, right? So if you look at the top social media platforms in the world, Facebook is number 1 with 2.2 billion users. YouTube is next with 1.6 billion users. After that is WeChat, which doesn't operate very much outside of the People's Republic of China, but there are some people in the diaspora of the People's Republic of China who use WeChat. That's hovering around 1 billion users right now. Pretty substantial. And it's a very interesting story. We can get into it maybe perhaps later. But after that, the next 3 are Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp, all 3 owned by Facebook. Right? Twitter is way down at number 12 in the world. Now, I started this conversation talking about the world because that's actually what concerns me far more. I'm sweating American democracy because I'm an American, but I'm sweating democracy with a small d around the world because of the places in the world where the dominance of Facebook is so much more than it is here. There are 220 million regular users of Facebook in the United States. That has flatlined, and as people, mostly young people, delay, defer, or ignore Facebook, right? Many of them will get older and then have reasons to be on Facebook, but they don't now. They're more often than not going to Instagram. Facebook doesn't care. Hey, great, there's no competition there. If Instagram had never been allowed to be purchased by Facebook, if that merger had been blocked, if the WhatsApp merger had been blocked, there might actually be competition for advertisers, which is what really matters, right? There might have actually been some growing competition. There is not in the world. Now, in many very important, sensitive places in the world, like the Philippines, Facebook is everything. There's no Twitter. There's no open web. There's no blogosphere. There's barely an independent culture of journalism left in the Philippines. It's been crushed by the Duterte government. It's a really sad situation. Facebook is everything in that country. It is essentially the internet. It is essentially the information ecosystem. The same is true in Indonesia. The same is true in Cambodia. The same is true in Myanmar. The same is true in Sri Lanka. And the list is growing. Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, right? This is a serious problem. Can you imagine living your entire media life through Facebook? That's what these countries are having to endure. And Facebook is filled with calls to genocide, with harassment. Authoritarian leaders and nationalist forces have a playbook on how they use Facebook in all of these countries. They put out their own propaganda, and they know how to make it rocket around. They put out propaganda that undermines any critic, any opposition party, any journalist, any NGO that's working on human rights, right? They distract them, they become hecklers, and they create the heckler's veto, and they can't actually move forward. And then they create a direct threat and harassment movement, often by hiring armies of trolls to issue rape threats, kidnapping threats, and murder threats against people and their families, right? Mostly journalists and NGO workers. This is going on country after country after country.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
Armenia, 2018, May. A revolution against the oligarchic rule was not maybe enabled fully, but significantly facilitated by the very existence of Facebook. I think Arab Spring, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how authoritarian systems in these what we call third world countries can be challenged significantly, if not totally toppled down, by the kind of connecting tissue that is enabled by Facebook. And specifically in the Armenian case, it was Facebook, not just Twitter.
And I just need to ask you to make it a very
Yeah,
short
sure.
answer so we can run to the pizza.
Human rights organizers will advise people in authoritarian regimes that Facebook is a terrible tool to use, largely because it's so easy to monitor activities of dissidents. It's so easy to infiltrate groups through Facebook. It's so easy to expose the workings and plans of groups. So the more dangerous the political situation, the less useful Facebook is as an organizing tool in authoritarian regimes. Twitter is completely useless, by the way, as an organizing tool against authoritarian regimes. Don't believe the hype. That is something that we heard in 2011. It was based on no facts and no data, and we can't seem to shake it. In fact, the Orange Revolution happened in January 2006, and Twitter was introduced to the world in March of 2007. Almost nobody was using Twitter in Egypt and Tunisia in 2011. Very few people. And those who were using it were cosmopolitans who generally spoke English and lived in places like Cairo and Tunis, while there were massive demonstrations in Port Said and in Alexandria and places where almost no one used Twitter or Facebook for that matter. But that's another story. No, the thing about Facebook is it is great for motivation. So if you want to fill Washington, D.C. with the Women's March, Facebook is a great way to make that happen, right? And there are many movements I would subscribe to, like Black Lives Matter, that have used these tools very effectively in non-authoritarian or maybe pre-authoritarian environments. And that's really beneficial to my side, but not necessarily beneficial for democracy, right?
So let's continue the conversation over some pizza, and please thank our speakers.
Thank you.